Hello and welcome to part 4 of my video series, Citizens Report on North Carolina DPI data for Wake County Public School System. In this series, we're going to talk about lots of things here. I'm going to cover more on the next chart. This is Blaine Dillard, and I'm looking forward to taking you through this, and hopefully this will be the final presentation, for a while at least. As usual, I will cite my sources where possible, and again, I want to reiterate that I've spent a lot of time on this, trying to learn. I'm really curious about these numbers, a lot of manual activity here to move these numbers around and put them in a consumable format with a good level of detail that hopefully you will appreciate and enjoy, and we'll think of your own questions and your own ways to look at this data. And I'd love to get feedback from you, so please send that to me at that email address there. So what are we going to cover today? First thing, follow up on charts that I showed at the BOE meeting back in October. That'll be about 5 pages or so. Then I'm going to dive into some subgroups, some scores from Math 1. Then I'm going to revisit the Wake County versus the North Carolina Delta chart that was shown at the BOE by Wake County back in September. So I'll revisit that chart and update it. Then we're going to dig into achievement gaps for Math 1. And then last but not least, we'll show some demographic charts. So kind of picking up where we left off in the last presentation, part 3, I showed these two charts. The one on the left came from Wake County originally in 2018. The one on the right is the update of that same data set with 2019 numbers. As noted in the previous presentation, there are some issues with just simply bringing in the 2019 number and comparing it to the 2018 number. And I talked about that at great length in the prior presentation. But I do want to at least start from here as we move forward. So this chart, which was shown at the BOE in October by me, it was showing the 2019 M1 GLP metric for Wake County as compared to the state of North Carolina and then many other districts. There are about 44 or so districts here, including the state. These are all the ones that had more than 500 test takers. I was showing in context just the 2019 number, showing where we performed as compared to other districts. I pulled in a couple of data points on some of the lines here, showing number of days missed due to the hurricane, showing the EDS percentage level. And one of the feedback points I've heard about this is, what about the fact that Wake County has such a large number of students who take Math 1 in middle school, and therefore those middle school test takers, they don't show up in this M1 metric. The thought was that those students, being high performers, they are being disproportionately left out of Wake County's numbers here, which is a disadvantage to us because it forces us to the bottom of the list when we compare to other counties and other districts. And so here's the CCR chart of the same data set. So what I wanted to do is provide a different view of this data. So what you're looking at here is a three-dimensional view, essentially. This is called a bubble chart. And what I'm doing here is on the x-axis, I'm showing the economically advantaged percentage. And then on the y-axis, I'm showing the high school test takers, the percent of those which were taking the test in high school. So if you're on the top part of this y-axis, that means you have more high school students taking the Math 1 EOC and fewer middle school students. If you're down here near the bottom on the y-axis, you have more middle school students and fewer high school students taking the Math 1 EOC. Similarly, if you're on the right side of the x-axis, this is the economically advantaged axis. So the further you are to the right, more economically advantaged you are. If you're towards the left, you're more economically disadvantaged. Cool. So in other words, let's look at some of these bubbles up at the top. In those districts, no students took the Math 1 EOC in middle school. So they had no data points for M1 SEP, which is the middle school metric. All of their Math 1 EOC results were captured in the M1 metric, which is the high school metric. So again, where we see Wake County on this chart is down at the bottom, because on the y-axis, we have a large percentage of middle school students who take the Math 1 EOC. So therefore, the percentage of our, or I guess the mixture of our high school versus middle school students taking the EOC is more closer to a 50-50 level. So we'll look at a couple of numbers here. Let's look at right in the middle. Carteret County missed about 3 weeks due to the hurricane, and they were actually the top performing district of the entire state, and roughly in the near 50% level on economically advantaged, disadvantaged. And then they have about, it looks like a little bit more than 75% of their students who take the Math 1 EOC are actually high schoolers. So here's Wake County down here with the 34.6 EOC score for M1. Then you see right next to us, Chapel Hill. They scored 61.7 on the M1 metric. That's why their bubble is a lot larger than ours. They are a little bit more advantaged economically as compared to Wake County, because that means they're a little bit more to the right of us on this chart. And then we actually had a little bit more percentage of middle schoolers that took our test than Chapel Hill did. So we're below them on the y-axis. And then also right in the middle is the North Carolina average, 41.2, which was better than Wake County and slightly less economically advantaged than we are. And then again, their mixture of middle school versus high school is a difference of about 20%. So take a look at Rockingham, 34.5, very close to us, just off by 1/10 of a point from us. Looks like they have about 10% more high schoolers than we do that take the Math 1 EOC. And then they're looks like about 13 or 14% less advantaged than we are economically. So this is the kind of graph you really have to stare at. Obviously, I didn't label all of the bubbles because it would just make the chart too busy. A lot of these numbers are placed on here automatically by Excel and whatever place they want to put them. So you can't really associate all of them to different bubble sizes, but the bubble sizes do reflect the GLP score. So I think you just have to stare at this and just kind of understand or try to think about what the trade-offs might be related to economically advantaged versus disadvantaged, and then whether high schoolers or middle schoolers are taking the test. Now, if we go to the next chart, we're looking at a similar bubble graph, but this one is for CCR. So this is where we have a real stark difference, I think, to a lot of the other districts in the state. Our CCR number for high school students taking the Math 1 EOC was 8.9 compared to Carteret County. Again, they missed 3 weeks of school. They scored 4 times as well as we did on CCR. Again, their numbers are a bit more advantageous than us based on the number of middle school students that take the Math 1 EOC versus high school students. But we are more economically advantaged than they are. So again, what is the trade-off of those two axes, and how does that contribute to test performance? Looking over on the far left, we have Revist County, which scored 8.4, very close to our 8.9. They missed 18 days due to the hurricane. They have an 80% EDS level. So in other words, they're 80% economically disadvantaged, and therefore their economically advantaged number on this axis is about 20%. Now granted, 85 or looks like about 86 or 7% of their students who are taking the Math 1 EOC are high school students. So they have a small number that take it in middle school. So here's what I wonder about Revist County as compared to Wake County. Wonder how many of the parents in this district, which is 80% economically disadvantaged, wonder how many of those parents can afford a tutor for these students who have earned an 8.4 CCR on the Math 1 EOC as compared to Wake County. How often have we heard about tutors and more tutors in Wake County? The demand for tutors it's through the roof in Wake County because our parents here can afford tutors. But yet we are only a 0.5 percentage point higher than Robeson County, which missed 18 days of school last year due to the hurricane. Again, here's North Carolina near the middle, 14.8 for their CCR. We're at 8.9, so they're almost twice our performance level. Now this is not something I expect anyone to stare at this video and read, but this is the table of data I used to make these graphs. And the boxes in green are the bubble sizes. The red box is the x-axis. That's the NEDS percentage, the non-economically disadvantaged percentage. And then the orange or yellow box is the y-axis, and that's the percentage of students taking the Math 1 EOC who are high school students. And if you have the digital version of this presentation, you should be able to use the link below, and you can actually access this spreadsheet yourself, and feel free to copy it and make your own graphs. All right, let's move on to the next part of this video. Now we're going to look at a deep dive on the Math 1 metrics. So as I covered pretty extensively in part 3 of the video, the Wake County versions of the Math 1 data, they attempt to show a clean year-to-year comparison of data by excluding bank scores. However, these data sets have several limitations that I covered actually in the last video. They can't be verified by the public. They can't be compared to the state or other districts. They can't be drilled into for subgroup or school detail levels, and they can't be trended over time in their own context if the definition changes. So for example, the 2019 new EOC has seemingly made it impossible to compare from 2018 to 2019. But I take exception to that. I think there are ways to to make comparisons, and I'm going to show you that here. And then last but not least, they may appear to be cherry-picked depending on what is shown and when it's shown. So my point of view here is that internally calculated data sets are generally underinformative and may beg more questions than answers. I think the best approach is to use standard metrics with context and explain the nuances, the little variances and the differences in why those standard metrics may vary from the ideal data set. I think that we can normalize our analysis by comparing data to other groups or other districts, or by using a ratio to a control group like the overall state metrics. Even if the as-is metrics are not ideal for year-to-year comparisons, the fact is that rules that apply to the state and other groups and districts also apply to us. So the effect there is that regardless of how the business rules change about Math 1 and how the tests evolve over time, if we compare to others, that's a useful way to assess year-to-year progress in order to detect impacts or benefits of local changes. So again, the bottom line meme here is I believe it's better to have imperfect verifiable data with context than perfect unverifiable data with no context. So let's talk about the new views of Math 1 data and how that compares just real briefly with the Wake County calculated metrics, and what are we giving up if we instead use the standard metrics. So first of all, 2016 and 17, the data I've been showing, what that metric shows is middle school and high school EOC scores and bank scores for ninth graders who took the EOC in middle school. So what Wake County uses is a pure high school only view. And that's their version 1 data that I talked about in part 3 of the video series, or the middle school and high school view, which is V2. Both of those exclude bank scores. So the main difference here is the bank scores are excluded in the Wake County view. So if we go to 2018 and 19, now NCDPI has broken the Math 1 reporting into two new numbers, M1 SEP and M1, and then we can calculate a third view, which is a blended version of that. So what's going on here is M1 SEP is the Math 1 EOC at 8th grade only. That'll include any banked Math 1 EOC scores to 8th grade. So if anybody takes it in 5th or 6th or 7th grade, that would get banked. And then once that student gets to 8th grade, that's when that would show up in their M1 SEP score. Same thing for 2019. And what Wake County uses for their middle school view is just a pure view, which excludes bank scores and includes all the middle school test takers. Again, that's a great metric, but we have no context. We can't compare it to anything. So I'd rather use the imperfect metric and be able to compare it in context. And then for M1, for Math 1 EOC in high school, that's what the M1 metric is. In 2018, that included the last year of bank scores of test takers who had taken the test in middle school, and then their scores were banked until they got to the 9th grade. That was 2018, and then 2019, finally, the M1 metric is now a pure high school only view of test takers for the Math 1 EOC. And then, comparing to Wake County, again, Wake County uses in 2018, they used a pure high school view. They, I call that version 1 of their data, excludes bank scores. And then in 2019, now the definition of what NCDPI does, it matches what Wake County uses for their V1 data set. And then to get the blended number, it's just a simple prorating calculation here. You just take the M1 times the number of M1 students, the M1 SEP times the number of M1 SEP students, and then divide by the total number of students. And that gets you a blended number of those two metrics put together. And I confirmed that calculation with Curtis at NCDPI. Again, there are bank scores in there in various places, as noted. But again, we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for context and insights and meaningful trends and deep dive analysis. And again, when Wake County used a blended metric, they only used the high school and middle school scores for that current year and excluded the bank scores, as noted already. So I showed this graph in part 3, but again, I hope this demonstrates how beneficial it is to be able to dive down into subgroups and look at demographics as they apply to each of the metrics that are captured. So here's a good reason to look at something like this. In Wake County, our middle school students who take the Math 1 EOC largely are non-economically disadvantaged. So these are the kids who are more economically advantaged. And then likewise, they also have a very large percentage of academically and intellectually gifted students. And then a very, very small number of English learners. At least in 2019, that number was only 38. And then you see the scores for this M1 SEP group were pretty high, 94 GLP, CCR 71. So if a school district only shared a blended type of a metric, one that only showed all the students together, we would have results similar to the row on the bottom. Not too bad, not too great, but acceptable, or at least not an attention getter to parents or board members. But when you dig under the covers and you're able to see the score broken up into middle school versus high school and all the different subgroups, then you can see the extent that these very smart middle school test takers are contributing to this overall score. And then that leaves the high school students, the ones who take Math 1 EOC in high school, the ones that are not predominantly in the AIG program, the ones that are almost 50-50 on EDS. Those students, their performance is not great at all. And so by blending those in with better performing students, it has the effect of hiding possible problems or possible groups of students who are not getting the attention they need or the additional education that they need to score better on these tests. And just look at the number of students in this M1 group. There are over 6,700 students in this group. Their performance on these EOC tests needs to be studied and understood, especially if we believe every student every day to be our motto. So let's dig into these one by one. What I'm going to show you next is a series of subgroup charts. It's 21 charts, and there's a lot to take in, so I want to kind of set the expectation here of how the chart flow is going to go. So I'm going to show 7 different subgroups, starting with all, and then there'll be a set of 3 charts for each subgroup. There'll be a blended view, which is a combination of both high school and middle school scorers via the M1 SEP view and the M1 view. And then we'll go and proceed through each of the other subgroups. So each chart is going to look like this. There'll be a GLP on the left and CCR on the right. I'm going to show state of North Carolina, Wake County, and Chapel Hill again. And I'll be showing the 2016 and 17 Legacy Math 1 EOC scores, just to see the context of that as compared to the various of the 3 metrics that we have now for 2018 and 19. So on this chart, for example, this is a blended view. So I'm showing 2018 and 19 will be the blended numbers. So this is going to be sort of the best representation of the total overall picture of how students are doing in Math 1, because it's including middle schoolers and high schoolers. But again, remember the M1 SEP number has some banking issues. So it's, again, it's not a perfect metric, but it is a metric that we can analyze. The next thing we'll show is a difference. So we'll show the difference between the Wake County and North Carolina, and then Chapel Hill and North Carolina. So you can kind of see the trend of how both districts are comparing to the state. And then last but not least, we'll show the number of students in each of these test groups. So one thing you might notice is from 2016-17, the numbers are pretty consistent. 156,000 for the state, 151,000 for the state, Wake County 19,000, then 18,000. Very similar numbers. Then in 2018, the numbers are also very similar. And the reason for that is because in 2018, the Math 1 metric, which again is a part of the equation that makes up this blended number, the Math 1 metric in 2018 did include bank scores that were left over from prior test takers in middle school. So then in 2019, the numbers are down for the state and for Wake County, and a little bit for Chapel Hill as well. The reason for that is that the banking is greatly reduced going forward. The only scores that will be banked henceforth are the ones that are students taking the Math 1 EOC before 8th grade. But again, all the explanations I've just given apply to the entire state, including Wake County. So with that said, here are the numbers, and then you will see this number 7. That is the number shown on the Wake County chart that was showing the comparisons between Wake County and the state back at the Board of Education meeting in September. Now, I calculated a 7 here, but you can see Wake County calculated an 8, and there is a reason for that. It's they used an earlier version of the state number, which made the calculation 8 instead of 7. But again, the point here is that the number shown on this delta chart is the Wake County calculation of a blended number, which reflects all the Math 1 test takers, middle school and high school, and excluding bank scores. But since we have the other metrics available, I think it's important to understand what those are, and that's what we're going to do here in a moment. Okay, so going on through, we are still looking at the all subgroup. This is all students. So now we're going to look at M1 SEP. Again, remember 2016-17, I'm showing the legacy Math 1 EOC on all of these charts for 2016 and 17. So we see M1 SEP, Wake County has a slight lead above the state still in that, but again, we're talking 94, 95, 93 numbers that are up already very high. And we don't know those numbers that are 95 in red. Those are cases where NCDPI reports greater than 95. So we don't know if it's 95.5 or 99.9. Then we have the M1 number. This is one that I talked about on at the Board of Education meeting, where I showed my graph that had the 35 and then the 9. And again, you can't really compare the 65 to the 35 and the 55 to the 9 because, number one, the numbers in 2018 were dramatically different because of the banking issue that we talked about before. And then additionally, the guidance from the NCDPI is that you shouldn't compare 2018 to 19 just because of the fact that the 2019 test was different and reflected new standards, which Wake County was supposedly completely very well prepared for. But it's worth noting that we have fallen behind the state in this metric. So again, the rules that applied to us in 18 also apply to the state. The rules that applied to us in 19 also applied to the state. So we were ahead of the state by 8 points in 2018. Now we're 7 points behind the state. I'm not showing that in the form of a percentage, but I can tell you the results for 2019 would be percentage-wise a lot more than the ones for 2018 because the raw numbers are smaller, but the delta numbers are about the same magnitude, but they're in opposite directions. So let's move on to the next subgroup. This is the black subgroup. This is, again, we're starting back with blended, so we're showing similar layout, similar format. And again, I think the focus here is on the change in time. I think that's what we should be looking at. This is the M1 SEP metric. And then the last but not least, the M1 view. Again, we were ahead of the state point-wise in 2018, now behind the state in the M1 view for black students in that subgroup. Now here I see a couple of zeros for the deltas. That's because the proficiency scores were above 95%. So I put them, just to do the calculations, I have to put something in. So I put 95. So those basically, we really don't know the difference of those because, again, that number could be anywhere from 95.1 to 99.9, any of those numbers. Again, ahead of the state last year, behind the state in 2019. So here's the Hispanic subgroup. For M1 SEP, not a big difference. Now here for M1, again, a pretty steady decline in comparison to the state. It's economically disadvantaged. Pretty competitive equally with the state on the M1 SEP for this group. But then when we look at M1, the high school students, they are definitely trending down and falling well behind the state. This is the English language learners blended. And then here we have M1 SEP for English language learners. I would consider this an outlier. You see the numbers, even for the state, it was only 206 students, of which 38 are in Wake County. So these 38 students outperformed these 206 students by 23 points. So that's really what this is telling us. So it's really not statistically significant because these numbers are such small samples among the larger populations. Then in AIG, this is almost not worth showing because we have so many 95s here. So we don't know if these numbers are 95.1 up to 99.9. So really hard to make a comparison. Same thing for this group, which is 95s across the board, or at least 95s across the board. And then when we come to M1, again, not a lot of AIG students take math in high school. They're usually taken in middle school. So these population numbers are pretty small here as well. So then back to this chart. So this is the one shown at the Board of Education meeting in September, showing the deltas between North Carolina and Wake County. And then what I showed from the part 1 video, I showed an update to the chart like this because I went through all the subjects and showed the 2016, 17, 18, and 19 EOG and EOC results, sort of show that trend. And then in this chart, I pulled in the 2016 number and the 2019 number, really just to show the 4-year trend of these scores. Okay, and I said we would discuss Math 1 later, and that's what we're doing here. So what we can do, because we have these detailed metrics, is we can pull in the new metrics that have become available starting in 2018. So the first one is the fact that in this graph, this delta chart, what was shown for grade 8 was the MA08 number. That's a blend of the 8th grade EOG and the 8th graders taking the Math 1 EOC. That was covered on page 15 in part 1 of the video series. Then we have M8 SEP, which these are the 8th graders who took the EOG who didn't take Math 1. Okay, so again, those numbers, again, we covered that on page 16 in part 1. Their scores are 8 points below the state. Then again, the 2016 Math 1 number is just directly from the EOC numbers. That was, we were 12 points ahead there. And then for Math 1 M1 SEP in 2019, that's, again, 8th grade students plus the scores banked previously. We're 1 point ahead there. And then we have the M1 score of being 7 points below the state for the high school Math 1 EOC test takers. And again, these contain no bank scores in this group. And then last but not least, we have the Math 1 blended number, NC DPI. Using those numbers, you can just blend those two metrics together. And then Wake County does a blending, which is pretty close to the first one, but it doesn't include any banked scores. So it just is a pure calculation of middle school plus high school. They got 8 on that calculation. I got a 7, so pretty close. And then for CCR, we have the same type of analysis. We can show in orange, we show the numbers that we can calculate using the standard metrics. Then, with all those numbers, we can create this heat map. So what this is showing is a 4-year trend for all the EOC and EOG subjects. So each number represents the lead that Wake County has over the state given, for each of these subjects. The color shading shows trends and magnitude. And green is good. The more green it is, the better. And red is bad. The more red it is, the worse. So the more green the number is, the larger the lead is we have over the state. And then the more red a number is, that would be a negative number, the more of a lead the state has over us. So what you can see here is just sort of an example. Let's look at the maths grade 6 EOG. The score there was a 13.4. 13.4 ahead of the state, and that was on slide 13, which we saw in video number 1. And then over time, that has trended down to where now Math 6 EOG we're only 7.3 points ahead of the state. And then again, for the new metrics, I don't show anything for 2016-17, but I do pull in the delta numbers for 18 and 19. So we have several new numbers. The M8 SEP, we're down in that. M1 SEP, we're pretty close, but again, all those numbers are in the 90, mid to high 90s. And then M1, we were ahead in 2018, we're behind in 2019, and that's it as far as the new metrics. And then similarly over on CCR, you can see we're behind the state in some of these new metrics as well. So hopefully this visual here gives a good view of kind of the trends of how we're going in all these subjects. Hopefully we can turn some of these around and head them back to being more green, because I think Wake County should lead the state in all of these subjects. So now I'm going to talk about achievement gaps. And so I'm going to have to use an example here. And let me just let you know, this is an example. These are not actual metrics. This is not about any actual district or group. These are made up numbers just to show an example. So we're going to use a couple of graphs on each of the pages to walk through the achievement gaps. Let's use an example for economically disadvantaged subgroup, which is EDS, and then another calculation for a subgroup called NEDS, which is non-EDS. So any student in the NEDS group would be considered not in the EDS group. So for this analysis, the achievement gaps are going to be a comparison of the EDS subgroup to the NEDS subgroup. The raw accountability metrics are shown at the top graph. In this example, both groups declined from 2018 to 2019. So NEDS went from 80 to 50, and the EDS group, subgroup, went from 40 to 15. The middle graph is going to show a simple calculation of the NEDS metric minus the EDS metric. The larger the bar, the bigger the gap. So in other words, the 40 is calculated by subtracting 80 minus 40 equals 40. And then the 35 is calculated by 50 minus 15 equals 35. So those are the respective gaps for these two groups for 2018 and 19. So in this example, it appears as though the gap for EDS got better from 2018 to 19 because it went from 40 to 35. And it did from an absolute raw score point of view. But did the gap really improve? No, it got much worse actually. In 2018, the EDS metric was 40. That was half of what the NEDS metric was. That was 80. But now in 2019, it's now 70% worse than the EDS metric. It's a 15 versus a 50. So the gap actually widened. So by using critical thinking, we can invert these ratios in our heads and conclude this. The NEDS group outperformed twice as well the EDS group in 2018 and about 3 times as well in 2019. And that calculation is shown on the right as well. So it's a difference of a gap of 50% versus 70%, which is a big difference. So let's talk about custom calculations. So some of the subgroups are available in the NC DPI data, and some of them have to be calculated. So for example, the white, black, and Hispanic and economically disadvantaged subgroups are all available in the NC DPI data from 2016 through 2019. For the NEDS metric, which is non-EDS, that was standard. That's a new metric available in 2019, but from 16 to 18, I had to calculate that number. And for ELS, English learners, that was a standard subgroup available for all 4 years, but NELS, non-ELS, how to calculate that. So AIG is a standard subgroup metric that's available all 4 years, and then non-AIG, I had to calculate that. So let's look at how the calculation is done. So let's use an example. We're going to use the state of North Carolina M1 2018 metric. So in this metric, we know from looking at the data in the database, for subgroup all, which is all students, there was 118,905 students. They had a 57.4 GLP. And then for subgroup EDS, they had 52,361 students and a 42 GLP. So the question is, how many students are in NEDS and what is their GLP? So here's sort of a picture of what that would look like. You know, there's basically ED students and NED students that are in the population of all. And then we can kind of draw a picture here that shows what we know. We know EDS is 52K or so. We know the GLP. And then what we need to know is NEDS and the NEDS GLP. So we can use basic algebra here to figure this out. Actually, this is before algebra, this first equation. We're just doing a subtraction. We can calculate what the NEDS quantity is. And then we basically use that blending calculation from page 81 to show how to arrive at the NEDS GLP number. So basically we can assume that these numbers could be blended together, and then we just have to sort of unblend them to break out the component to get the actual GLP for NEDS by itself. And a correction there, actually it's on page 88 where that blending equation is. And then, so what subgroups are compared? So we're going to look at black compared to white. We're going to look at Hispanic compared to white. We're going to look at EDS compared to NEDS. We're going to look at ELS compared to NELS or NELS, and then non-AIG compared to AIG. And then the red identification here, those are metrics that are calculated by me. And the exception there is NEDS for 2019 because it was available from the DPI. Okay, so now we're going to start looking at achievement gap charts. And again, like I did before, because these next 8 charts are a little bit, I guess, busy, a lot to take in, I'm going to give you a little preview reference here. So the next 8 charts will roll out as follows. I'm going to show the Legacy Math 1 EOC for 2016 and 17. That'll be on page 121 for North Carolina, and then we'll follow that with Wake County. Then we'll show M1 CEF, which is a 2018 and 19 number. That'll be on the next 2 pages for North Carolina, Wake County. Then M1, which is also 18 and 19, and then the blended, which is also 18 and 19. Okay, so let's walk through the first one slowly and explain what's on it. So this one is the Legacy Math 1 EOC. So this is middle school and high school and bank scores for 2016 and 17. So the first things we're going to see on each of these coming up charts, will be GLP on the left, CCR on the right. And again, this is only for North Carolina on this particular chart. So what you're seeing here is by these different subgroups, what the scores were on this particular test, which was Math 1 EOC. So 2016-17, these are the different subgroups and what they scored. Then we'll show a gap. So the gap is just simply a calculation, as I showed on the previous page, black versus white, Hispanic versus white, EDS versus NEDS, Ls versus NELs, and NAIG versus AIG. Just showing a subtraction of the leader number minus the subgroup number. Then we express the same figure as a percentage. So again, this is showing the percentage difference of the subgroup compared to the leader group. So for example, so in this case, there was a 43% difference in the EDS performance compared to the NEDS performance. And then that went down to a 38% performance difference. So there was an improvement here. These gaps got smaller in this case, this one went up a little bit, and this one went down. Then we're also going to show a little table at the bottom that just shows those differences. So anything that's in green is going to be a negative number. So that's showing the achievement gap got smaller. Anything that's in red is going to be a positive number, and that's going to show the achievement gap got larger. So in most cases with the state, the achievement gap is roughly around 4 to 5 improvement in both GLP and CCR, the exception being the English language learners, where it got a little bit wider there. So we want the gaps to be narrowed is what the objective is. We hope to see over time. Okay, so here we are looking at Wake County now, the same group, Math 1 EOC. These are Wake County students. And similarly, we have about some improvement in the gaps across the board with the exception of the English language learners. In both cases, the English language learner gap increased. So what I'm showing on this chart is both the Wake County and the state gaps, deltas. So Wake County and state gap deltas. So just to kind of bring them all together, basically the numbers from the previous chart to show whether the gaps are closing or widening. And then we can circle the ones that are better, because again, this is a lot of numbers to take in. The larger the negative number, I guess the more negative the number is in green, the better it is. And then the larger the number is in red, the worse it is. So in other words, if it is a green number, we want it to be a larger negative number. So in other words, a lower negative number. So 5.1 is better than 4.8. Not by much, but it is an improvement comparison. More negative number like the 5.1 versus the 4.8, that's the 5.1 is a better result. The negative 4.1 is better than negative 1.7 because that gap closed by 4.1 versus closing by 1.7. Both are improvements, but again, we're just circling the ones that are the better one. And then on the other side, the red numbers, we want to see a smaller red number, not a larger red number. So the number of 5.4 is a bigger increase than a 2.9 increase. So now we're switching to a new metric. This is the M1 SEP metric, and remember this started in 2018. So the prior charts were 2016-17, the legacy metric. Now this chart is showing M1 SEP, which is the new metric that started in 2018. So what you'll see here is first of all of the gaps increased. Also notice the ELS gap. That's a much larger number than all the rest of them. And let's note this, what I put up in the corner here. Note that the number of students that are in that group, the ELS group, are very, very small, like 2% in 2018, about 1% in 2019. So it's a very small sample size that make up this number of ELS students. So at this point, I would not give a lot of stock in that one. But do notice that the CCR numbers, all of these numbers have increased. These gaps have all increased at least 10 points. So let's take a look at the gaps here for Wake County and the M1 SEP metric. Across the board, all a little bit higher in GLP, but over in CCR, they're quite a bit higher. Now we do have this one surprising green number, which is a closing of the gap. But again, this is a case where there's only 38 students in this population. So I don't give a lot of stock in the ELS numbers for the M1 SEP group. Now, if we pull in the state numbers from the previous chart, you'll see that for GLP, again, omitting or not focusing on ELS, But for the GLP numbers, most of them are pretty consistent with the state. But if we look over at CCR, we do see a difference in Wake County's performance versus that of the state as far as the achievement gap goes. So for example, Wake is about 4 points worse than North Carolina on the black versus white achievement gap and the M1 SEP metric. Then we're 8 points worse on the Hispanic versus white achievement gap, and 8 points worse on the EDS versus NEDS achievement gap. And again, I'm comparing these numbers here when I give those differences. So now let's move on to M1. We're back to looking at North Carolina, and you see the gaps here. Similar situation, the GLP gaps widened a bit, and the CCR gaps widen even more so. We go to the North Carolina page, we see also all these gaps widened except for the ELS gap over on CCR. And then if we bring in the state numbers, we see there are some puts and takes. Some cases Wake's better, some cases the state's better as far as the achievement gap change. And then last but not least, let's look into the blended scores here. This is where we're looking at achievement gap with a blended group, blended calculation. We see for North Carolina, again, the gaps widened for all the scores across the board. For GLP, most of them were under 5. And then for CCR, most of them were well over 10. Then if we look at Wake County, similar, we have growth, or I guess increase in gaps in all cases, more than the state. And you'll see in all cases across the board, except for ELS and College Career Ready, the gaps increase more in Wake County than they did for the state. Some notably big differences here are the EDS numbers for GLP. About a 6.4 point difference here for GLP for NEDS versus EDS. And then for CCR, black versus white, 4.5 difference here, 7.3 difference here on Hispanic versus white, and then a 6.2 difference on EDS versus non-EDS. So now we're actually getting into the home stretch of this presentation. So next we're going to talk about demographics. Again, the next 12 charts are a lot to take in. So the way this is going to roll out is as follows. We're going to show 6 charts for 2018. We'll alternate between North Carolina and Wake County. And we'll start with M1 SEP, then go to M1, and then blended. And then we'll do the same thing for 2019. All right, so let's take a look at each of these here. So this is the 2018 M1 SEP demographic. I'm going to show 4 pie charts on each page. So here we have one for race that breaks down the numbers of the different races. Then we have EDS, the economically disadvantaged. Then we have AIG. And then lastly, we have ELS. Then on each page, I also will show the total number of students that are in this particular population for this metric. So I'm not going to really talk about each one of these separately. This is more for reference. This is helpful when you're looking at some of the other charts and you want to go and figure out how many students of that subgroup were in this particular metric for this particular year. So you can come and reference these charts. North Carolina blended. We have Wake County blended. And now we're switching to 2019. We're back to M1 SEP. And there's Wake County, M1 SEP. Then M1, M1 for Wake. And then blended for North Carolina, blended for Wake. Okay, so after all of that, what does it all mean? So first of all, let me just restate again. I really hope that anyone who's publishing data for public viewing will adhere to a few basic principles and will do things such as explain the chart subject domain and provide meaningful context and data sources whenever possible. The public deserves to know where your data comes from and what it represents and how it compares to other similar data in other districts or the state. Not everyone is going to go to the level of detail that I've gone through to get to this analysis and prepare all of this information. But I'm certain that there are many parents in this county who are just as qualified as I am to understand and do this type of analysis. Second, I want to just remind you that none of the analysis in this Part 4 presentation relied on any comparison of 2018 versus 2019 raw numbers for the Math 1 EOC results, thereby neutralizing the Wake County assertion that the 2018-19 data should in no way be compared to any prior years. In other words, by comparing year to year using ratios or comparing only within 2019, the set of analyses in this presentation is in fact useful. Additionally, what I'm seeing in this data is that it's clear that when math students reach 8th grade, fortunes are diverging as advanced students choose to take Math 1. With the separated math metrics for 8th grade and Math 1, this is having the effect of bringing to light the performance of students who are not the advanced students. In other words, the regular kids who deserve a strong education just as much as the super smart kids. And I have 3 sons who range across the spectrum from a regular kid to a super smart kid. My regular kid, who is going through the Math 1, 2, and 3 sequence right now, received an entirely different experience than my super smart kid who went through it 4 years ago. And in those cases, as evidenced by the M8 SEP metric, those are the 8th graders who didn't take Math 1, and the M1 metric, those are the same students once they reach high school and then take Math 1. Wake County is very much underperforming the state. The argument may be this. Of course, Wake County has a larger portion of students who take Math 1 in middle school. This has the effect of leaving our high school Math 1 takers to compete against districts which have smart kids who could have taken Math 1 in middle school, but didn't. Therefore, those districts are inflating their high school Math 1 score. That's certainly one explanation, but is it plausible? Is it provable? In 2016, it appeared as though 6th and 7th graders taking the math EOG were the strongest students in a subject as compared to the state. These should be some of our strongest students now, having recently completed Math 1. Even if you go with the most optimistic view, the blended view, the 2016 to 2019 lead over the state has been nearly slashed in half, from 13.4 to 7. Let's again look at this heat map. If you will recall this, well, here's what I'm talking about. In 2016, they took the math EOG in 6th grade and outperformed the state by 13.4 points. Now those students, 2017, they're in 7th grade. 2018, they're in 8th grade. 2019, they're in 9th grade. So certainly these students and these 7th graders here back in 2016, those are the ones that were probably taking the Math 1 EOC in the last 1 or 2 years. Their results have gone from being the best in this analysis comparing GLP deltas with the state to now in 2019 it's some of the worst that we have. And again, even that best case scenario, that Math 1 blended number, we're still ahead by 7, but again we've dropped almost in half there. Regarding the subgroup analysis, in 2016 to 17 the achievement gap was closing for Math 1 across the board at both the state and Wake County levels. But from 2017 to 18, with the new Math 1 metrics, the gaps are widening again, more so in Wake than in the state in general. The GLP gaps are typically widening by less than 5 points in the state and a few additional points worse in Wake County. And then the CCR gaps, they're widening by 10 plus points in many cases in the state, and an additional 4 to 8 additional points worse in Wake County for many cases, but not all. So how do we wrap this up? Does the sum total of this analysis prove definitively that Math 1 is broken in Wake County? Or do the excuses given by Wake County overcome any negative numbers in this 147-page report that I've done, such as those reported by the News and Observer in an October 31st story? Here's an excuse. The state used to bank scores for middle school and count them in high school. We have a large number of middle schoolers who take Math 1. The 2019 Math 1 EOC test changed to more closely match the standards. The scores on the new test are different than scores on the earlier test. It's simply not possible to compare this year's Math 1 state test results with prior years. Wake has trailed the state average for economically disadvantaged students for many years on many exams. I have to look at that last one especially just to say, hey, are we just going to keep accepting that, or are we going to try to do something to change it? Look away at your own risk, citizens, but as for me, I think there are enough red flags to warrant concern. So let's wrap up here. We'll go back to the Aristotle graphic again. I think this is a great quote. Again, be a free thinker. Don't accept everything you hear as truth. Be critical and evaluate what you believe in. I hope you will go look at these numbers and study them more carefully and have even more insights than I have here. I hope I've helped explain this, and I hope everyone enjoyed this and will learn something from it. Thank you for listening.